Hello everyone, welcome back to another devlog on my airborne farming simulator. Since last time, I've added many new features to flesh out the game and make it more enjoyable to harvest the main resource, called Cetarium. A lot of these features completely change how the game is played, which is very interesting and exciting, but they can sometimes be difficult to properly balance. Regardless, I think it would be interesting to take a quick look at how these new additions work. I'd like to start with the new items, which are easily the most eye-catching things in this update. The first of these I created was Magnetism, which allows you to pull in nearby Cetarium, making it much easier to collect a lot in a short amount of time. This is a feature I've been meaning to add for a while, because collecting Cetarium without it is a bit cumbersome to say the least. At the moment, it's simply an item that applies an effect to the player, but in the future I'd like to make it a permanent upgrade, probably obtainable fairly early on. The next item is called the Sky Orb. What this does is double the amount of Cetarium that generates in the air. It lasts as long as the current screen is loaded, and yes, you can use as many of them at once as you want. It's incredibly overpowered, so it's almost certain that I'll change it in the future. The question is, how should it behave differently? Maybe it should only stay active for an hour, or maybe you should only be allowed to use one at a time. I don't know exactly, but that's something I'll experiment with in the future. Moving on to the compressor, the idea behind this object is that you can insert 10 Cetarium, and after a bit of time passes, it'll be compressed into a denser material that's more valuable. I haven't actually created this material yet, so in its place the compressor returns 20 Cetarium to represent the raised value. This transformation is very short, though I'll definitely increase its length in the future. The main thing I want to ensure as I work on it more is that it doesn't replace normal collection techniques. Those should be the focus of the game, and the compressor should exist to supply additional income when there isn't as much Cetarium floating around. This last item is very unique. It's called a duplicator, and it will randomly duplicate Cetarium floating nearby. Sort of like a sky orb, but permanent and on a small scale. I imagine it would be a lot of fun to string many of these together to try and maximize the output. This also encourages you to think about the whole space you have to work with. Just like all of the other items, it'll take a bit of tweaking to make it balanced, but so far I think it's a great addition to the player's toolset. Outside of the new additions, I also went back and improved the Cetarium catchers, so they can now only hold one Cetarium at a time, which snaps in place much more smoothly. Overall, these new items significantly improved the game's quality, though there was still one thing that was really bothering me, and that was the way Cetarium was being generated. In the old system, it would be generated along the edges of the screen. The main problem I had with this is that a player could theoretically prevent any Cetarium from reaching the center by blocking the edges. Also, any changes to the generation, like using a sky orb, would have a long delay before its effects are fully seen. These aren't particularly major problems, though I did want to attempt to make a better system. What I came up with is that the Cetarium is generated inside the screen, rather than along its edges. This solves the two previous problems, which makes the generation seem much more dynamic. Unfortunately, it also has some limitations of its own. Since the Cetarium never despawns, there will naturally be a higher concentration of it further in the direction of the wind. I could solve this by giving the Cetarium a timer before it disappears, but I could imagine that it would be very annoying for a player to try and chase after one, only to have it disappear right in front of them. In the future, I might implement this behavior anyway, though I could add special conditions, for example, to only despawn when off-screen, which might feel a bit more fair. Of course, I could also end up using a completely different solution if I find one that works better. In the world, I also made some small adjustments to certain objects. For example, the Cetarium box now asks you how much you want to sell, which makes it much easier to sell a lot at once. I also changed the transport wire that takes you to the town. It previously worked by default, but now it must be activated with 30 Cetarium. This is to ensure that you've spent some time collecting it before you leave your property. This is actually the first roadblock I've added, and I think requiring a certain amount of Cetarium is an engaging form of progression, and especially if I add more instances like it, it's a good motivator for the player to improve the productivity of their farm. In the town itself, I also added a new shop. At the moment there's nothing inside, but this is where you'll be buying many of the game's tools and items. There's one final gameplay change I'd like to touch on, and it's one that you might have already noticed. The inventory is now no longer slot-based. That is to say, instead of the inventory having a certain number of slots that can hold a single item type up to a certain amount, you can now hold as many different item types as you want. The only limitation is that you can't go over a certain weight limit. I know that I previously justified using a slot-based system, but over time, as I added more items, I realized that it would be a common situation to have a lot of one item type, but few of others, causing your inventory to get full when it doesn't really seem fair to. Since I don't see a significant benefit to justify using a slot-based system, I finally decided to switch. Personally, I think it already feels much more natural than the old system. Somewhat related to the inventory is the new HUD. I was meaning to add some new elements to it anyway, so I decided that I might as well give it a full makeover at the same time. All of the elements have been moved closer to the edge of the screen, and those old out-of-place background shapes have now been replaced with much sleeker black bars. There's also a new day counter that shows which day you're on. This information seemed a bit less important than the current time, so I wanted to make it appear smaller. To do this, I actually created a brand new font with smaller characters, and I think it turned out pretty well. I also use this font in the inventory, where it makes the item labels much less intrusive. And that's most of what I've finished since the last devlog. What I appreciate about this work is that it makes the game feel a good amount closer to completion. Now, there's multiple different ways to collect Cetarium, all with strengths and weaknesses, and there's actual uses for Cetarium in progressing through the game. As I continue my work, I'll probably keep adding the same sorts of things, like more items, tools, and places, though I also want to put more of an emphasis on improving the game's presentation. At the moment, I'm feeling very optimistic, so hopefully everything will continue to go well. Thanks for watching. Bye.